Hi, my name's Deborah Campbell. I live in Oklahoma. I'm the founder of Love My Liberties. It is a grassroots community organization. And I'm hearing a lot about wanting local control of our schools and true choice in education. Well, to achieve these two goals, you need fair competition and you need to prohibit the federal money and the U.S. Department of Education. I looked at accreditation. Private schools and Christian schools apply to the State Department of Education. They typically use an accreditation agency. The agencies must be approved by the State Department of Education. These agencies supervise the process. They don't do the approval. The next thing I looked at was education criteria for teachers. Well, the State Department of Education establishes that. The State Department of Education does certification, licensure, regulations, and much more. I looked at how public schools are funded. We know they're federal schools because they rely on federal money. Congress gives money to the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education disperses that money to the State Department of Education. The State Department of Education receives state and local revenues. Private schools don't. They get relief money. Private schools don't. Other forms of federal money, the schools, the local school board, the state school board, and the State Department of Education. They can apply to the U.S. Department of Education, and they can apply for programs, grants, research, pilot programs, field testing. The State Accountability Test has federal monetary incentives. And there are third parties that offer things through the U.S. Department of Education, and their money is typically federal. And the reason for the third party is so that the U.S. Department of Education can circumvent their limitations. And in September, I'm going to talk more about the U.S. Department of Education and federal overreach. So then I looked at the Oklahoma regulations for private schools. It gives governing authority to the State Department of Education. It says several things. I'm not going to go into all of it. I'll highlight. It has the criteria for your principal. Well, as a business owner, that's like having your competitor come in and tell you who you can employ, what the criteria is for your employees. And this one I could not figure out. This is so funny. Under curriculum, it specifies that the private and Christian schools must have the American flag on their campus. I don't have a problem with that. I think it's great. But why under curriculum? Better yet, how about the American flag, the Trump flag, and the thin blue line flag? I'm all for that. Then they talk about the schools must have 6 hours of rigorous academics. Well, does the public schools do 6 hours of rigorous academics? I don't think so. There is a lot of record keeping and reporting that the private schools have to do and give to the State Department of Education. One of the reports concerns me. It identifies the child, the immunization status of the child, the doctor of the child, and the parents' information. And then that's done annually, and it is given to the State Department of Education. The State Department of Education takes that data gives it to the Oklahoma Department of Health. The health department does the enforcement. Well, under Oklahoma Statute 70, it gives governing authority and enforcement powers concerning childhood immunizations to the State Department of Education over the private, Christian, and public schools. But it does not specify if those private and Christian schools are accredited or not. So there needs to be clarification. Then there's areas in there where it says does not exist at this time. As a former investigator, that is a red flag. That is telling me that it's coming soon for them to take over those areas. So keep that in mind. So where's the autonomy? That's the intent of private schools, Christian schools, homeschooling, public schools, autonomy. So then I started wondering, well, does the Oklahoma State Department of Education and the State Board of Education monopolize the education industry? Well, it appears that way. So then I was wondering, how can we create a fair playing field? I came up with 3 recommendations: separation of powers, funding, and prohibiting the U.S. Department of Education. Now, the funding part goes hand in hand with the U.S. Department of Education. And what I mean by separation of powers is create an entity that the private schools and the Christian schools can apply to. That entity can be responsible for accountability of the schools. We need to amend all Oklahoma statutes to remove the governing authority that the State Department of Education has over the accredited private and Christian schools. They also need to amend the Oklahoma Statute 70 and remove the governing authority and enforcement powers given to the State Department of Education concerning the childhood immunizations. And as far as funding, the legislation needs to be specific. It needs to specify that they prohibit federal money coming from the U.S. Department of Education. They need to specify that the schools, the local school boards, the state school board, and the State Department of Education cannot apply for federal money. They cannot apply for programs, grants, research, field testing, pilot programs, state accountability tests, or with the third parties, any of that has federal money attached to it. And if you do that, that creates a fair playing field, because then the public schools are going to rely on their state and local revenues. In closing, I want to warn the Oklahoma legislators and parents. Proponents for federal funded schools will use fear-mongering, and they will exploit children with IEPs. Before IEPs, there was 504 plans, and they still exist. 504 plans are enforced by the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education. I know what I'm talking about. I worked for the Office for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education, and I investigated non-compliance cases. When a child qualifies for an IEP, they receive federal money. That federal money is conditional. It has requirements for record keeping. That money is to follow the child and to be used only on that child, not the classroom. And when I was a former investigator, when the agencies did compliance reviews, we would do audits, and the schools would fail the compliance review because they could not locate the money, because they did not do the record keeping correctly. Now, everything that's in an IEP can be put into a 504 plan. And I will tell you, the schools will not tell the parents about 504 plans, and they don't want them because they don't get federal money. But I want to say there's nothing to fear, that the parents have 504 plans that they can use. So please don't give in to the fear mongering and the exploitation of the children that have IEPs. Thank you.